Sometimes a single act of kindness has the power to change everything. Picture this: a billionaire father, used to power, control, and respect wherever he goes, walks into a simple roadside diner one morning. He is not there for business, not for luxury, but because his young son, who is disabled, had begged him for pancakes. The man, Richard Hale, was known everywhere as a titan of industry, a man who owned skyscrapers and companies, a man who was admired and feared. Yet at that moment, sitting inside that modest diner, he was simply a father who felt helpless. His son Daniel struggled with his trembling hands, trying to feed himself. Spoon after spoon fell short. The boy's frustration grew, and Richard's heart ached because there was nothing his wealth could do to help his child at that table. And then came Emma, a young waitress with tired eyes and a warm smile. She had been running between tables, carrying trays and wiping counters. But when she noticed the boy's struggle, she didn't hesitate. She crouched down beside him, guiding his spoon gently into his hand, encouraging him to try again. She wiped the spilled syrup from his chin and spoke to him like he was the most important child in the world. Daniel's face lit up with a small smile, a smile Richard hadn't seen in weeks. For Emma, it was second nature. For Richard, it was extraordinary. He sat there in silence, watching this woman who earned tips to survive treat his son with more love and patience than anyone he had ever hired. It made him realize how often people looked past his child, seeing only the disability or the father's wealth. But Emma saw Daniel, just Daniel, a boy who deserved kindness and dignity. Richard, who had spent years building an empire, suddenly felt powerless. All the money in his bank account couldn't buy the simple humanity Emma offered so freely. When breakfast ended, Richard asked Emma to sit for a moment. She was hesitant. Waitresses didn't usually have conversations with men in suits who looked like they belonged on magazine covers. But Richard's voice carried no arrogance, only sincerity. "You didn't treat my son like a burden," he said softly. Emma smiled, shaking her head. "He's not a burden. He's just a child who wants to be seen." Her words cut deeper than any business negotiation ever could. For the first time in years, Richard felt vulnerable, and for the first time in a long time, he felt seen too. The next morning, Richard returned to the diner, but not for pancakes. He asked Emma a question that startled her. Would she consider working with his family, not as a servant, but as a companion for his son, a teacher, a guide, a friend? Emma's heart raced. She lived paycheck to paycheck, her life held together by late shifts and small tips. Yet the thought of stepping into a billionaire's mansion frightened her. That world was not hers. But then Daniel reached for her hand, his eyes lighting up with hope. And in that moment, Emma knew her answer. What began as a job turned into something much more. Days turned into weeks, and under Emma's patient guidance, Daniel began to grow. He ate with confidence. He laughed more freely. He even started to draw pictures, something he had given up on before. The mansion that once echoed with silence now rang with laughter. Richard often stood at the doorway, watching in awe. He realized that though his billions had built an empire, Emma's kindness had built a family. One evening, as Emma read Daniel a bedtime story, Richard whispered to himself, "She didn't just change his life, she changed mine." In Emma, he found something no wealth could buy: hope, love, and humanity. And in that small act of kindness at a diner, a miracle began that forever changed them all. This story reminds us that true riches are not counted in money, but in compassion. And if this touched your heart, don't forget to like this video and subscribe to The Kind World, because kindness has the power to change everything. As Emma leaned closer to guide Daniel's trembling hands, Richard found himself frozen in his seat. For years, he had been the man who solved problems with the stroke of a pen, the signing of a contract, or the purchase of a company. In boardrooms, people hung on his every word. In the world of wealth and power, he was untouchable. Yet here, in the quiet corner of a modest diner, he was nothing more than a helpless father. His son's small smiles, so fragile, so rare, hit him harder than any business victory he had ever celebrated. That smile didn't come from therapy sessions he had paid thousands for, or from the expensive doctors he flew in from across the globe. It came from the gentle kindness of a woman who didn't even know who he was, who didn't care about his last name or his fortune. The world saw Richard Hale as a man with everything: private jets, sprawling mansions, endless luxury. But beneath the polished image was a loneliness money couldn't mask. Since his wife's passing, he had buried himself in work, convincing himself that success was enough to fill the void. He thought wealth would shield his son from pain, but in truth, it had only isolated them further. And now, watching Emma wipe syrup from Daniel's chin and whisper words of encouragement, Richard felt something break inside him. She wasn't paid to be there, she wasn't obligated, yet she gave her heart freely in that moment. He realized then that compassion, genuine selfless compassion, was something his billions could never buy. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like a billionaire. He felt like a father longing to give his son the one thing money had never been able to provide: real human connection. When the plates were cleared and the diner's morning hum began to fade, Richard did something entirely out of character. Instead of leaving a bill large enough to cover the week's wages for every server, he asked Emma to sit down for a moment. The request caught her off guard. Waitresses didn't linger at tables, and certainly not at the request of a man who looked like he belonged in the pages of a business magazine. But there was something in his tone, gentle, almost pleading, that made her pause. Emma slowly slid into the booth across from him, her apron still smudged with syrup stains and coffee rings. She looked at him not as the world's billionaire mogul, but as a weary father with tired eyes. Richard's gaze shifted from his son, who was now doodling on a napkin with newfound joy, back to her. His voice was quiet, almost breaking. "You didn't treat my son like a burden," he said. Emma's eyes softened, her hands resting gently on the table. "Because he's not," she replied without hesitation. "He's a child who just wants to be seen, to feel like he matters." Her words settled between them like a weight, heavy and undeniable. Richard leaned back, swallowing hard. As his throat tightened, he had spent years surrounded by people who only told him what he wanted to hear. Lawyers, partners, assistants, they all admired his power, but none ever dared to pierce the armor he wore. Yet this woman, with her simple truth, had dismantled it effortlessly. For the first time in years, Richard didn't feel like Richard Hale the billionaire. He felt like Richard the father. And in that moment he realized that Emma had just given him something far more valuable than respect. She had given him honesty wrapped in kindness. The next morning, the bell above the diner door jingled again. But this time Richard Hale wasn't there for coffee or pancakes. He stood in the doorway, tall and commanding as always. Yet there was a vulnerability in his expression that Emma noticed right away. She wiped her hands on her apron nervously, wondering why a man of his stature would return to a place so ordinary. When the morning rush slowed, Richard approached her with a calm determination. "Emma," he began, his voice low but steady, "I need to ask you something unusual." Her brow furrowed as she nodded for him to continue. "I don't want you to think of this as a job offer," he said carefully. "I want you to think of it as a chance to change a boy's life. Would you consider spending time with my son, guiding him, encouraging him, helping him feel seen the way you did yesterday? Not as a servant, not as an employee, but as someone who cares." Emma froze, her heart pounding. She was barely surviving on tips, her life a cycle of long shifts and bills stacked on her kitchen counter. The thought of stepping into a billionaire's mansion filled her with doubt. She didn't belong in his world. What could a diner waitress possibly offer a man who already had everything? And then Daniel looked up from the booth where he was sitting. The moment his eyes met hers, they lit up with joy, as though he had been waiting for her all along. That look, pure, unfiltered trust, made her decision for her. She swallowed her fear and whispered, "Yes." In that instant, Richard knew he hadn't found an employee. He had found the missing piece of his son's life, and perhaps the missing piece of his own. This story reminds us of a truth we so often forget, that the greatest treasures in life are not measured in money, or power, or the size of a bank account. True riches are found in love, in kindness, in compassion, and in the small moments of humanity that connect us all. One waitress, one act of pure selflessness, transformed not just a boy's life, but a father's heart. And in that transformation, we see that kindness has the power to heal wounds even billions cannot touch. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to pause for a moment, reflect on the goodness that still exists in the world, and help us share it further. Make sure to like this video and subscribe to The Kind World, because every click helps us spread stories that prove kindness is still alive, still powerful, and still capable of changing the world. Together, we can remind the world that compassion is priceless and it's within all of us.